Well, the color blue is the motif with which we are invited to visualize the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the theme behind the work of a visual artist and photographer, Tatenda Chidora. As we fought to shield ourselves and each other from the sickness, masks of various kinds and shapes became and still are symbols of the moment. If COVID was a color, creates a portrait of black resistance. He joins us now to tell us more about his work. Tatenda, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us. If COVID was a color, that's a very interesting title to pick for your art piece, your artwork, your creation. Talk to us about what was behind, the idea of if COVID was a color, and of course blue as the color and the motif.
Generally, when you watch TV, most of the times, medical series, they always wear masks, and we only had them in real life over TV, or unless you go to the hospital and you're on some kind of isolation, and it's like you really have to wear a mask away from everybody. So I was just generally experiencing that to say that the everyday life in the hospital has now become our real life, and we had to mask ourselves. And when it all started, we didn't have a lot of variations of masks, so we were bombarded with this color, blue. Had to wear gloves at some point. I was at a shopping mall buying stuff, and this lady was all suited up from top, and I was like, is this the new reality? Is this what's going to happen? So the color blue was always quite prominent for me, and it was always visible to me all the time. And just generally, when they say code blue, in hospital, it's always from a place, okay, we have something happening in the respiratory system. So hence, if COVID was a color, the color that really stuck to me the most was blue. Yes.
Now, you're a photographer, a visual artist. When you were piecing together the work and you happened across this idea of using blue as the color, as the motif for COVID-19, I mean, what sort of images were you trying to bring together in this instance?
So, I mean, we've had a lot of information around the COVID-19. So there's a lot of documentary images, there's photojournalism, there's a lot of even scientific data that revolves around it. So when I sit as a visual artist, our responsibility is always to bring relativity and to bring life to what is happening in any situation. And I just happen to challenge myself to say 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, when they're talking about COVID-19, what other image and what other different perception would people have to translate what happened in this time? And then I challenged myself and I said, probably if I was to make costumes, if I was to make something different with the everyday material that we have. Hence, I went on to experiment with masks, the PPEs that we were seeing. They were quite prevalent in the time, and like never before, we have to walk masks at all times. So that was my challenge to say, from a fine art perspective, well curated and well thought about, what would I bring to the world that they would appreciate and see this differently? In a different aesthetic manner, I would say.
I mean, I'm very curious about artists and how they're interpreting the pandemic. The perspective that we often discuss at a platform like this is, the plight of artists because of COVID-19, the lack of access to opportunity because of COVID-19. And so it's very interesting to see someone use the pandemic as a source, in fact, from where you actually draw to inspire yourself and to continue in your creativity. And I'm curious if that was the conversation that you were having with yourself, or perhaps with your peers or other people around you, to say, I actually want to see if I can't draw anything from the pandemic and not necessarily dwell in the fact that so much has been taken because of this global health pandemic.
Absolutely. I think at the start of the pandemic, we were all shook. And a lot of confusion. I'm a freelancer, and at most I work on commission basis, or if somebody does hire me to come in for a job. And for the first time in the pandemic, I think if my apartment could speak, if the walls could speak, they'll probably be like, oh, you've been here for too long. And I've never seen you, because before that, there was a lot of momentum, and there was so many things happening. And there was a lot of confusion when we got into the hard lockdown to say, okay, so what would be the next thing? Because I doubt if we're anyhow essential. unless if someone said, oh, okay, we have to go back to work from a commercial point of view. So then from there onwards, the body of work I did create for myself, because I'm thinking, okay, this could be what I'm perceiving, and this is what I'm feeling, the vulnerability, the loneliness. And it's always from a point of translating where you are at as an individual. But then I remember I posted the first image, and there was an overwhelming response from it. And then from a place where people were now requesting to buy prints, and this had been from a place where I hadn't had income probably for like 2 or 3 months. And then I'm now in a space where I'm like, oh, I do have something definitely coming through. And from there onwards, I decided I could challenge myself more. And instead of now looking at how bad things were, I could definitely then create something for myself in this space.
Yeah. I think just lastly, Tatenda, you talk about this future generation of people going through your artwork and trying to, understand what we were going through during this pandemic. What sort of emotions do you expect some of your audiences to get really from being exposed to your artwork, from being exposed to some of these art pieces?
Vulnerability, confusion. We're in a place of, I think, also resilience, which is probably one thing that we don't really get to celebrate. I mean, there's a lot of data every day. As humans, we get so emotional. Oh, so many people died. So many people caught the pandemic, which is real. But there hasn't been anyone who's really celebrated how, as a human race, we've stood above this. And in much repetition, I'd love them to see hope, courage, standing above, way above what could have been. It is deadly, and it was really shocking and confusing, but people really have had it within them to stand out so strong behind it. So emotions of vulnerability, resilience, hope, seeing light beyond what could be a pandemic. Not could be, but is a pandemic. So when hard cases, when hard situations come, there's always a tunnel of hope. And there's always light coming through.
That is so important, the story of human triumph. And you're right, I don't think that's spoken about enough whenever we talk about the pandemic. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us. That is visual artist and photographer Tatenda Chidora joining us there to talk to us about his latest piece, If COVID Was a Color.